Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about Disney's The Santa Claus. So, really, when finally getting back to rewatching this movie, Tim Allen and just like really this movie is still really fun to watch. Like this movie kind of goes in the cusp of almost like Christmas Vacation, which I had recently just reviewed. And so recently it's kind of like one of those movies that every once in a while uh you'll probably find and want to watch again. And like really it's always a movie that always lands, and it's always a funny film. And recently you have other movies that came after this that ultimately like they might quasi be funny, but not as good as this first one. Which ultimately I'd also bizarrely I'd seen the Santa Claus 2 before I saw the Santa Claus 1 recently. So I guess eventually I will probably maybe review Santa Claus 2. But I don't know. I kind of just like this first one because I think anything that happens after the second or third kind of just like it just feels like the jokes are just kind of missing, and they're pushing the story more, which ultimately like the story isn't all that like ooh ah yeah, this is a story that absolutely needs to be told. but but I like this one because the jokes are great. I liked every single aspect of the jokes in here. And recently you have Tim Allen that is really providing a lot of those jokes, and you can really just enjoy them along the way through this movie. So, really, we have it to be funny enough, just really a movie that takes Christmas, makes a joke out of it. To ultimately, we have on a seemingly Christmas Eve that is not really going quite right for either Charlie's character or Scott Calvin's character, because ultimately, like Charlie is just kind of like in the middle of two parents because ultimately they are going through a divorce, and ultimately Laura is seemingly going with Neil, who is a psychiatrist or psychologist. So we ultimately have in this film we have Scott Calvin, who ultimately is a toy maker, who ultimately is kind of having a Christmas party success, and then ultimately ending up with his son. That ultimately they are just trying to put together some kind of meal for this holiday. And most of the meal is just kind of like reasonably like Charlie ending up having to just put up with whatever. Like he doesn't really get a special meal for this holiday. He just kind of gets whatever that a Denny's will provide. Uh, so going into here, we of course have this trope about seemingly Charlie needing to wait it out for, of course, Christmas to come. Ultimately, we have Tim Allen, who is ultimately reading to Charlie, of course, the traditional story Night Before Christmas, which kind of we have played to death through any number of Christmas movies, but recently even to the point of like me just watching Christmas Vacation and hearing that same portion that story was in that movie as well. It's like, dude, you got to put it everywhere. Like even like when I was watching Silent Night, Deadly Night, like there it's in that too. A horror film that has to also bring up the the night before Christmas. Anyways, so we ultimately have. I'm gonna tee this up a little bit. We ultimately have it to be that ultimately that we have seemingly at one point where Charlie actually hears a clatter, and so reasonably we have Scott Calvin investigating this clatter, ultimately to notice that there is some guy seemingly on the roof of his house, and he doesn't understand why. And ultimately, that person is actually Santa Claus, and Santa Claus ends up falling off the roof of this house to ultimately force Scott to ultimately grab all the clothes that ultimately would have that had bizarrely been uh, left upon his yard by all of a sudden this Santa bizarrely vanishing away. Ultimately, where Scott is ultimately just like, hey, where did he go? Is he naked? Is he running around naked? So pushing Calvin to ultimately go into now having to get a ladder, and evidently the ladder is uniquely designed. So we have it to where Calvin investigates the sleigh, ultimately to have it take him to the next house, the next house, the next house, and he has to perform every single duty that Santa does, and then eventually has to seemingly become Santa at some point, going to the North Pole and otherwise performing as Santa. And I thought that was like the jokes that happen on here where of course Scott Calvin can't really believe what he's seeing, and everybody who is at the North Pole is like, oh, you have to believe it won't be possible if you don't believe, and this and that. So recently it just pushes on to eventually having quite easily just it being just okay. Well, every single year, we have Scott Calvin who is consistently trying to deliver presents and this and that, and so. But then we also have it to be a problem of like Charlie is taking everything and telling everybody the truth that ultimately Scott Calvin is Santa Claus and no one's going to believe him and everything. Everybody's eventually going to think he's crazy, and so Scott has to justifiably try to tell his son, hey, how about we keep this whole Santa thing between us? Because reasonably, everyone else is just going to think you're crazy and take you away from me, which ultimately his mother tries to do, Laura. And so that's what makes for a very interesting movie to the point of escalating this to have some bizarre things go on in this movie to eventually lead to eventually the main goal, Santa delivering presents. So that's all I think I want to say about this movie in a very quasi non spoiler like way. I think it's about time to say let's go into spoilers about this movie. So, really, beyond all the things that I've probably just said, there's not much in my head that I have to like really heavily go into. But like everything is just kind of easy to talk about and this and that. There's some funny maybe jokes and stuff like that that happen within this movie, but other than that, there's not. I would probably hope that there probably isn't much to go into this with and talk about. But I find this movie every single year to always be funny. It's probably the one time where ultimately I'm like, yeah, like I will always go back to this Tim Allen movie. Like I think maybe at some points like Galaxy Quest might be a good Tim Allen movie to always go back to. Some people might say Zoom is probably another one that like has superpowers, and you ultimately have Tim Allen in that movie as well. Um, but yeah, so let's go into that double five territory and let's go into spoilers about this movie. So, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time we can spoil this movie. So, ultimately, the very beginning of this is, of course, seemingly Calvin just having a successful quarter for Christmas. Ultimately, him and some other coworker are relishing in their fruits of their labor from their work. Ultimately, being at this seemingly Christmas party, and So we eventually have it to where Scott Calvin kind of skips away from this party to ultimately get his son. That ultimately he has to go to Denny's and try to make some kind of Christmas meal, which ultimately isn't much of a Christmas meal, because when Charlie's asking like, "Well, hey, like, how can I have chocolate milk?" and Denny's is like, "We're out," and he's ultimately like, "Well, I guess I'll just have like regular milk." And so he's ultimately just like, yeah, I guess I'll just get whatever they have to just serve me today. So we have it to where, of course, this is Christmas Eve. We have Scott Calvin eventually telling uh, telling Charlie the story of the night before Christmas, and eventually, at some point, they just stop talking about the night before Christmas, and eventually have Charlie go to bed. Uh, Charlie wakes up Scott Calvin because he hears a clatter, and ultimately that is what is rhyming within this whole thing. So, of course, we have it to where Scott checks out what the ruckus is, and ultimately it is Santa Claus with his reindeer. And so ultimately you have it to where Scott is like, "Hey, what are you doing on my roof?" And then Santa Claus ultimately just falls off the roof, and ultimately we have to where Scott Calvin is just like looking at this guy and he's like, "Hey, you all right?" Like, "Hey, man," like he's checking on him, he's like poking him and whatever, and he's like, "Hey, man, I'm just gonna check for ID." And ultimately, all he finds is a card that ultimately says, "Hey, like, if something happens to me, like, put my clothes on and get to my sleigh and reindeers, they'll know what to do." So ultimately, we have it to where when Scott and Charlie look away, whoever Santa was is now gone. And ultimately, that's when you have Scott Calvin saying, "Hey, is this guy running around naked? What's going on here?" So we have it to where Scott grabs all the clothes and ultimately is making his way to get a ladder to get to the sleigh. And ultimately, the ladder that is notably mentioned is Rose with the clatter ladder, I guess. So ultimately, Charlie's like, "Oh my god, like this thing is like reminiscent to what we just read." So we have it to where now Charlie and Scott are getting onto the sleigh, and then ultimately they're just like, "Okay, like how are we gonna get this sleigh off the roof? There's no way to do this." We ultimately have it to where we're seemingly Tori seemingly like Charlie ultimately activates the sleigh while Scott is just trying to fumble through the sleigh and this and that. To where ultimately Scott and Charlie end up going to another house, and ultimately Scott's like, "Oh no, 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 this isn't home. This is like, hey, what are you doing? Like, come on." So Charlie is telling Scott, it's like, "Hey, you have to perform the duties of Santa. You have to give all these people their presents." And he's like, "Oh, well, how am I going to do that?" So ultimately mentions about this. Ultimately, we have Charlie mention about the sack and stuff like that. So Charlie's like, "Okay, well, fine. Like, I'll put on all the clothes." And hopefully, whoever is in this house is a tailor, kind of referencing Home Improvement, where their home, of course, were of the Taylors, and so, but also reasonably, like the joke actually makes sense that he's actually going to need a tailor because this suit does not fit. So reasonably, we have it to where we have Santa grabbing the sack, and now he's seemingly having the sack push him through any number of seemingly either fireplaces or otherwise having when a house doesn't have a fireplace, the home adjusts to have a fireplace to ultimately have Tim come in and out of. So we ultimately have it to where in the first house, Tim ends up kind of running into a dog seemingly, and that ultimately makes him have to rush out. Funny enough, when Scott gets out of the first house, Charlie's like, "How did it go?" And he's like, "It felt like I was on America's Most Wanted." And he's like, "God, this is like we're breaking and entering. We're gonna go to jail." But Scott keeps trying to do this until eventually all the prisons are gone, and then eventually he heads to the North Pole to ultimately see this barbershop like pole, this candy cane like barbershop like pole. When some kid this uh, the North Pole being seen by these people by having this code 1239, which is bizarre. So Tim eventually gets to see the North Pole as well as Charlie does, and so reasonably we eventually head into them having to be kind of told what to do in fine print. We ultimately have a Bernard that ultimately tells both Scott and Charlie, uh, like within the fine print, it's like, hey, like you put on the suit. Like if anything, you are Santa now. Everyone is calling him Santa. He's like, no, my name is Scott Calvin, and everybody's correcting him every single time and calling him Santa or Santa Claus or whatever. Because like basically, hey man, you have the title. Like Bernard is breaking it down as like this is a legal like contract. You are now Santa Claus, and like this is an actual clause. You put on the suit, you do his work, and so now you are him. And it's like it's non-negotiable. So we have it to where we have them just kind of having to go through this whole thing, and eventually they are just kind of looking around at the North Pole and they're just in awe. We ultimately have Bernard who gives Charlie a snow globe and ultimately tells him like, hey, like hold on to that snow globe, it's going to be important. So reasonably we go on to, of course, have Scott Calvin going to have, of course, SC pajamas, which ultimately he, I guess, would just assume it's for Scott Calvin, but no, it's for Santa Claus. And so, reasonably, we have we have Charlie easy and quickly going to sleep, but Tim Allen is just kind of second guessing a lot of this stuff. He's like, "Hey, is a polar bear down in the North Pole like directing traffic?" And we have this elf that is just like, "Well, hey, you have to believe in all this." It's like reasonably, if you like you have to like if seeing is believing, then you have to believe all this. And so Scott Calvin is really just a skeptic, and ultimately, once he wakes up the next day in his own home, he probably imagines that he just dreams all of this, but ultimately, he still has the pajamas on of SC. So, we ultimately have to where supposedly a lot of boxes are being delivered to his home because ultimately Bernard told him, "Hey, we're gonna give you the lists." And Scott Calvin's like, "Lists? What are you talking about?" Taking a list, checking it twice, gonna find out who's naughty or nice. That's the list. So eventually, we get just this giant list of all of these boxes out of numerous trucks, and all while that is going on, we are now starting to consistently see eventually this montage repetitiously of Scott Calvin eventually growing a lot of facial hair miraculously overnight. Eventually, he ends up getting a little bit more heavier in the belly area, of course. He gets fatter. So recently he ends up going to work, really just mentioning it's like, oh yeah, like I had a bee sting. My body just swelled up. I guess I was allergic and I didn't even realize it. Who knew? And so reasonably, when all the people are going through the meeting, and reasonably, Scott Calvin is like mentioning all the stuff that he wants to eat for through this meeting. Like, are you sure that it's just a bee sting, or like did you just like heavily put on some weight there, buddy? So funny enough, you have the one scene where ultimately where we're right after Scott Calvin's boss is ultimately telling him, it's like, hey man, like you need to see a doctor or something. Like there's something up with you, because you're different. Ultimately, when they are otherwise trying to sell some Santa tank like toy, Scott Calvin is like, no, like we have to go traditionally with a sleigh and reindeer. Like if anything, like no, this tank thing is not gonna work. And everybody's like, dude, we're trying to make money here. We're trying to make money off this toy, and you're not wanting any part of it. So that pushes him to ultimately be going to a doctor, going on a treadmill, and ultimately, like, he's telling this doctor, it's like, dude, I grow facial hair overnight. Like, I've gained, like, tons and tons of weight. Like, this is unreasonable. Like, what is going on with me? And the doctor has no real answer, but just say, oh no, this is all normal. Like, hey man, like, ultimately, like, Scott's like, but my hair is turning whiter overnight. And ultimately, like, the doctor's just like, well, that's just old age. And like, giving every like excuse of just like, well, you're getting older, like yeah, weight gain just happens. And like there is like really just trying to justify all this, but there's no rational reason for this person gaining so much weight overnight or whatever. But the doctor just isn't just like, well, there's nothing I can tell you. There's you just gain a lot of weight, and you're just getting older and growing hair, and this and that. It's just so we have it to where Scott is just he's just growing hair. He's just growing facial hair, and every time he tries to shave or every time he tries to dye his hair, it immediately just comes back, and he's just like, "Oh crap." So we really have it to where seemingly now when Scott is trying to see Charlie, you have it to where Charlie is mentioning how like Scott is being Santa Claus and how they went to the North Pole and all this other stuff. Like Charlie's really just so excited about this whole North Pole thing, and like Charlie is even trying to train on how to try to do the sleigh for whenever he would get the sleigh yet again. And so ultimately we have Laura and Neil who are getting a little concerned. They're just like, okay, like our son is just enamored about Scott being Santa Claus, and this doesn't even make sense. And like come on, there's no way that like Scott is just trying to perform this Santa Claus like act to win Charlie over, and this isn't right. So we have it to where, or really, Laura is just thinking that either Scott or her son might quite possibly be crazy or an imbalance. To where Neil is just like, yeah, I think they need to see somebody. Um, but ultimately, we have Laura and Neil who are both talking about their times of which the one perfect gift that they never got from Santa Claus, and that made them stop believing. To where Laura mentions that she never got some mystery date board game, and ultimately Neil is mentioning that he never got an Oscar Mayer whistle, which I'm just like, yeah, like the one perfect gift that you need to have now. Bizarrely, I don't know. I don't know. But anyway, so we have it to where Scott Calvin is ultimately eventually just trying to be Santa Claus, but also trying to rein his son in, and ultimately just telling his son, it's like, hey, like, you can't just tell everybody that I'm Santa Claus, even though you and I know that this Santa Claus thing is true. Like, don't tell everybody. Like, just keep my secret. And eventually gets to where Charlie is just going, okay, I will go along with your secret, because more and more that ultimately Charlie pushes this, the more and more that Scott is ultimately losing custody of Charlie. Uh, so recently, we have it to where Scott is trying to, I guess, memorize every single person on the planet's name, ultimately saying if they're naughty or nice or not. You ultimately get him telling certain people that they are naughty, and then we ultimately have like uh, Scott also confirming who is very nice. Like one of the girls is like, "Oh, she is very nice," and she's like, "Yeah, good luck there, slay boy." So we have it to where Scott is even trying to like go, trying to smooth somebody, but if anything, like nobody's gonna be looking at this guy twice. But anyways, so sadly enough, but anyways, so Scott eventually we have him to eventually just keep performing this Santa Claus like act. It seems like everything is working well, getting to the point of seemingly like Scott is desperately wanting to ask eventually, like, well, how do we get beyond me falling off the roof? Like, how can I stop myself from falling off the roof like my predecessor had done, and nobody's really giving him answers. And but they're also like inventing stuff for him. They're giving him like a flame retardant suit and this and that. Where ultimately they have to like dance out bizarrely to this ZZ Top song at some point. But anyways, so what ultimately happens is that we have to where we have to where Charlie uh, wants to just run off with Scott because ultimately Charlie knows the truth about Scott that he is Santa Claus and no one else will believe him and Scott is ultimately just like, well, yeah, I am Santa Claus and no one else can believe it. And but Charlie's believing in me, but ultimately like I'm trying to fan off this like him telling people that and but so recently like Scott is trying to tell Charlie it's like, hey, how about you stay with your mother and your father and like I will do like Christmas alone. And Charlie is wanting to uh go off with Scott, and that's what's really creating friction. And ultimately that's where Laura wants to own custody of her child. And so ultimately we have like arraignments and all kinds of other stuff. And recently just kind of gets to the aspect of like we have to where Charlie seems to want to just run away to Scott anyways, and ultimately that makes it so that the that Neil and Laura might assume that Scott had taken Charlie without their consent, and so ultimately they go out and try to um, arrest Scott because ultimately it's like, hey, like he is uh, he is ultimately like he doesn't have custody anymore, but he's taking his son ultimately taking his son to do some slaying and stuff like that without his mother's permission. So reasonably, yeah, just the cops are called. Cops tend to arrest anybody that looks like Santa Claus, but then eventually find Scott Calvin's character and arrest him. To ultimately, they're ultimately asking for his name, and ultimately he's like Santa Claus. And it's like Saint Nicholas, and it's like to the point where he goes ho ho shisho, and like all these other funny names of sorts. So while Scott Calvin is of course in prison, we have it to where now the North Pole is just like, well, hey, we gotta get Santa Claus out of prison. So hey, how about we send in the elves? That ultimately it's like it's some acronym for something where it's like Flight Squad and this and that. So we have these elves coming in, breaking out Santa because ultimately they need him to perform his Christmas duties and can't do that behind bars. So they break him out and ultimately have it to where seemingly that we have Neil and we have Laura looking or talking to Scott uh, about custody and about this and that. Like Scott is giving Charlie to Laura and Neil. We eventually have Bernard that is ultimately coming into the house as well, ultimately asking if Neil's sweater is something that the North Pole had made. Uh, but anyways, so Neil is mentioning, oh my god, like look at all the elaborate measures that Scott is trying to go to pull off all these tricks to make it seem like there is a North Pole. And so we recently have it pushed to it being that ultimately Scott Calvin is going to eventually just kind of push off of, to his sleigh to ultimately deliver all to deliver some gifts to Neil and Laura, which ultimately are the gifts that they have been missing for years now. And so both of them get these gifts, and Charlie eventually gets also gets a soccer ball, and so Scott ends up just kind of leaving off to go and perform his duties to eventually have everybody in awe. They're seeing a sleigh with reindeer fly off and this and that. So eventually we have Scott coming back to retrieve his son to ultimately just kind of do a little bit of slaying here and there. But of course, Laura is mentioning like, well, yeah, go ahead, but like, don't go over any don't go over any oceans. Don't go any like don't go for very long and this and that. And to ultimately like the very stickler mother is trying to protect her son, but it's like anyways. So kind of a fun movie, but yeah, like it's there's always a lot of fun gags. You have at one point where when Tim is in the North Pole trying to take off his clothes to otherwise go to sleep. Go to sleep. Of course, you have the puppets that are like ah, and like screaming, and then ultimately Tim puts his like pants and suspenders back on. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of funny moments to this movie. You have it to where the girl who's an elf that is ultimately telling Scott Calvin, it's like, oh hey, I'm already taken, and Scott is just like, oh okay, yeah, sure, It's like those moments are kind of funny. But really, anything that kind of comes with the whole Santa, the original Santa, and Scott Calvin kind of reacting off of his like first nights of duty, I think those are kind of fun. You ultimately have Scott telling people that he's lactose intolerant and that he can't drink the milk, and but then eventually when he becomes Santa Claus, I guess he can drink milk. And but funny enough, the girl the following year gives him soy milk, and he ultimately is like, "Yeah, I think your milk went sour." And she's like, "Oh no, that's soy milk because you said that you were lactose intolerant." And he's like, Oh yeah, I did say that last year. Well, thank you for remembering. So yeah, it's just a lot of funny things going on in this movie, and like recently you have like the one kid that is awake while Santa is up and out and doing his stuff, and there's a lot of funny stuff going on in there. You have had some point where like Santa is just kind of chucking the presents because ultimately he just doesn't care, because ultimately he's like, dude, like man, whatever, like I don't want to do this whole Santa Claus thing, like ultimately to the point where I think he ends up like taking a boat out of his sack and has to put a boat into someone's home. So yeah, so funny things happening within this movie, but I think that's all I wanted to say within this movie was just kind of like breaking down some of the scenes, some of the funny stuff, and recently every single time when Tim would grow his facial hair or grow his hair white or try to like adjust himself, like it would just kind of be like kind of Evan Almighty, where when Evan ended up turning into like this Moses looking character, how uh, when Evan would try to cut his hair and or otherwise um, try to take off these Moses like robes. The Moses robes would just come back on, or otherwise he would like completely grow out his hair or beard or whatever. And so like those are really funny moments, and like this movie does that same kind of thing. So Evan Almighty, of course. So yeah, going into this movie, I thought it was fun, and recently it's just like I it was a real comical movie, and recently there's a lot of other jokes that I probably could have mentioned but I probably easily forgot about. So without a doubt, I think that's all that I wanted to say about Santa Claus. I think overall this is probably a movie that probably didn't need to be talked about, or neither did National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. But yeah, you know what? F it. It's just a Christmas film that I could talk about and just enjoy. I hope that you enjoy this review or whatever. That ultimately, like, oh yeah, he did like this movie, good. Or maybe he like talked about it and whatever, and talked it out and whatever. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.